is the role that uncertainty plays in creativity. And so I want to explore very briefly the creative potential of uncertainty 70 years on from Guildford's presidential address. So let's dive in. So Larry mentioned this. This is the opening line, opening two sentences of Guildford's presidential address. The idea of this kind of hesitantly wanting to talk about creativity amongst psychologists who, for whatever reason, good or bad, did not really look into it. And this is where, you know, Guildford kind of threw down the gauntlet and said, this is something that all of us as researchers that are interested in this phenomenon, but also interested in human psychology, should be exploring. And that he had these aspirations to explore this. But his address, well, he outlines a lot of possibilities, is really an address about there is so much uncertainty surrounding the state and nature of creativity itself. And so he kind of implied that, you know, uncertainty was moving him and the field to trying to understand what is this phenomena all about. And so, you know, taking inspiration from Guildford, I'd like to say that my work has also started looking at this role of uncertainty. And uncertainty is something that a lot of thinkers have spent a lot of time talking about, particularly the pragmatists in the United States, John Dewey, William James, but also, and often less recognized, and I think most importantly, is Charles Peirce. So Peirce talked about uncertainty as a state of genuine doubt. It's not something that you know, we can kind of trick ourselves into. It's when we have faced a situation where the old ways of thinking and acting no longer work for us. And I think we know this all too well in the current state that we're in, but we experience this throughout the course of humanity, right? Uncertainty is something that's always with us, but it's something that as humans, we really do not enjoy experiencing. And so, if you will, you can imagine there's this kind of continuum of responses that we typically have when we experience uncertainty. You know, part of us, and I'm one of those folks, when we experience uncertainty, one of the first things we want to do is quickly eliminate it, try to avoid it, resolve it. There's entire fields of study that are on kind of uncertainty and risk management, trying to anticipate, address it, and resolve it before we even experience it. On the other end of the coin, and this is where some of the pragmatists talked about, they would say not only is that impossible, it's problematic, that if we too quickly move to resolve uncertainty, we could be selecting options that are not viable, right? So Dewey talks about the importance of kind of adopting this orientation towards uncertainty where we are okay sitting with it so that we can engage it and perhaps even invite it into our lives, because it is uncertainty that serves as this kind of catalyst for not only learning and growth, but also creativity and innovation. And I think even though, you know, we've quickly moved to Zoom and so on, I think there's still, and that helps us kind of resolve like, okay, well, this is the way we can do talks and this is the way we can perhaps teach. And I kind of came in a little early about these conversations. This is, you know, technology is not the appropriate vehicle for education and human interaction. I mean, I think it's a nice tool, but I don't want us to resolve our uncertainty around how can we continue to work in this world that has changed. And Rick talked about that a lot. I think there were nice elements of uncertainty in Rick's presentation. So what I want us to do is kind of think about our own beliefs around uncertainty and interrogate those. And like I was saying, in Dr. R's introduction to the volume, she was talking about some very complex challenges, not only COVID-19, which we're all kind of experiencing, but also we're becoming much more on the kind of human stage. There's a much more voice to the kind of injustices and inequities that have long been with us. Who is going to address those, right? These are moments of pause and reflection that if we sit with this uncertainty, then perhaps we can come to new ways of thought and action, not only to resolve, you know, pandemics and these kind of global things, but also the way we are as humans, to change the way we think, to change the way we act as humans. So I invite us to do this in this brief time that we have together. So in this way, I would argue that uncertainty serves as a gateway to the possible. It's a gateway for us to engage in new ways of thought and action, which, by the way, is the way in which we typically define creativity in the field of creativity studies, a blend of originality and something that's kind of meaningful or useful. So really, that's just about thinking and acting in more generative, meaningful, and positive ways that are different from the ways that we have been acting before, whether as individuals, groups, organizations, nations, or the world itself. So uncertainty, the beauty of it is, aside from it being uncomfortable, it disrupts our routines and habits and really serves as a signifier that new ways of thinking and acting are needed. Unfortunately, in many settings, like schools, for example, we engineer uncertainty out of lessons. We try to design lessons down to the moment where there is no uncertainty. And part of that is because our own identity as educators or parents or educational leaders or policymakers, we think, you know, what kind of parent or teacher would I be if I didn't know where this lesson was going? What kind of leader would I be if I didn't know what is the outcome of this? So I think we're compelled to kind of try to resolve uncertainty somewhat unnecessarily and somewhat rapidly and problematically by either trying to force-fit solutions or try to ignore it or do all sorts of things, when in fact, if we just recognize it, that this is a moment to stop. So the first move with uncertainty would be to kind of stop. And that's part of like the creative process as well, is to kind of sit with it. And we know from the earliest creativity studies that, you know, problem finding is sitting with the problem, right? Exploring it, making sure is this actually the problem that we need to solve? Or is it a symptom of a deeper issue that we're not even recognizing? So again, sitting with uncertainty, I would argue, is the first step to moving towards new ways of creative thought and action. So in this way, I would argue uncertainty is not only a catalyst of creativity, it's a signifier of when we actually need to be creative, because we don't always need to be creative, but it's also the condition by which we engage in creative thought and action. So it serves this kind of persistent role throughout the entire process. And even when we produce outcomes that might feel like it's finished, it's still good to have a little uncertainty that those kind of creative outcomes can be kind of inconclusive. We might revisit those and say, you know what, there's probably still a better way. Maybe there's a better way of teaching than using Zoom, right? Who knows? Right now it seems pretty viable, but we can't just be okay with that. We want to kind of continue to trouble that, or like I say, is keep this kind of little uncertain pebble in our shoe. So whenever we feel like we've come up with the best solution to a problem, that as we take that confident step, there is a little irritant there reminding us that perhaps there is a better step that we can take. So before we get into this, I do want to assert this idea that we don't always need to think and act in different ways. And so this is something that, you know, James Kaufman and I have written about, creative metacognition, and some of my colleagues internationally and I have started looking at and empirically studying, you know, what is creative metacognition? It's about knowing when and when not to be creative. Creativity, yes, you need confidence, but you also need to take risks. You have to be willing to take risks. And sometimes those risks are warranted and sometimes there's not. I mean, the field has talked about malevolent creativity, right? Sometimes creativity that might seem beneficial to us is actually doing harm to others in systematic, historical ways, right? So I think we want to think about principled action, principled risk. Is this the appropriate time and context to do something different? And what are the potential side effects or unintended consequences of doing this? So we need more of a principled approach to creative thought, and also to help young people think about, and I think this is where a lot of kids get in trouble in school, and my daughter has resisted school in so many different ways and has had these experiences. And many of the conversations we've had together is really about trying to understand, is that the time and the place for doing something that maybe your teachers won't see as creative, but will see as a disruption? So I'll just share one brief story, but I have, you know, legions of stories with her and other folks. But when she was in preschool, they had this no potty talk rule at her school, right? You couldn't use profanity or talk about potties or whatever. And so she had a flatulence, right? So she knew not to, you know, call it a fart, but she said, I just had a poop bubble. She told me that story, which I thought was adorable, right? And I was laughing. She said, I don't understand, Daddy, you know, why are you laughing at this? And they think that's funny when my teacher got really upset. And I said, well, it's context. Context matters, right? In the context of our car, I love that. That's a very creative way of describing that. But remember, in your school, there are these rules about no potty talk, right? So yes, we probably have to rethink, you know, why would a kid get in trouble for saying something, especially a preschooler, when it is kind of a cute, creative way of doing that. But the idea of helping young people navigate those spaces so that they don't get kind of worn down when they are trying to be creative, and then they feel like, well, no one's listening to me and I have no creative voice. So helping them find their creative voice, and part of that is helping them find allies and context in which they can express that voice. So I would say when we need creativity is when we come to an impasse, when getting from A to B, the way we've always done it, no longer works. That's when we need to explore other possibilities. So that's when we encounter uncertainty. So again, uncertainty that really kind of stifles us. The other time when we need to think creatively is when we invite it into our lives. So anytime we engage in any kind of improvement effort, or we plan for change, or we want to express ourselves creatively or artistically, we are actually inviting uncertainty into our lives. So that's another viable time when we need to be creative, right? And so uncertainty is still at the heart of it. I would argue uncertainty is the engine for this process to occur. Because as we sit, if you're an artist and you sit in front of a blank canvas, you don't know exactly how that's going to turn out. If you're an educator and you're designing a lesson, you don't know how that's actually going to play out when you teach that lesson. Or if you're a manager and you're designing a meeting or an initiative for your organization, we don't know how those plans are actually going to turn out, even if we try to engineer out any uncertainties or contingencies. So in this paper that I've written recently, and I've done additional work on uncertainty, but if you want to see a very brief kind of thought paper, you can go to this little URL up here, this little bit.ly URL, and you can kind of read the paper. But in there, what I'm talking about is that not all of our experiences with uncertainty motivate new ways of thinking or acting. In fact, sometimes when we experience uncertainty, it doesn't change anything. And I would say there are two cases where that seems to be the case. One case is when we experience mundane uncertainties. So these are uncertainties, and Dewey talked about this as well, is where they often go by without much notice or response. So, I'm not sure what I'm going to be eating for dinner tonight, but that's not going to necessarily make me stop in my tracks and, leave this presentation and go figure out a recipe. I'll resolve that later. So I can kind of put that off. The other is profound uncertainties. These are uncertainties that really kind of test us at a very kind of existential or even ontological or epistemological level, where we don't know. It seems like it's completely unknowable. So some people are experiencing COVID right now, or the injustices that we've lived with forever, right, as unknowable. And so one way to kind of resolve that is people just kind of say, well, we're just going to have to live with it. There's little we can do to actually resolve it. But I would argue the space where we all, and I think creativity researchers are more inclined to think in this space, is the space of actionable uncertainty, where it's a state of doubt that rises to our level of awareness, but we also feel that we not explore new possibilities, but we have a responsibility to do so. So not only are we capable, so not only do we have the efficacy, as Rick was talking about, but we also feel like we have the responsibility. Now, what I would argue is many of the profound uncertainties that we face in life, that we characterize as profound, and this is a very subjective judgment that we all make, or sometimes we make in teams or leaders make, are actually actionable uncertainties. So again, Dr. R talks about this in the entry chapter, right? Who is going to take on these things? These are actionable items, even though they feel like they're completely unknowable and they feel too profound for us to kind of step into. I would argue many of these are actionable. And one reason why I feel like young people and all of us feel like actual uncertainty is actually a profound uncertainty that we can't do is because we have lived in so much overstructured, overplanned, overwrought learning experiences or life experiences. Anytime we plan something, a learning experience is so overplanned that we really don't have opportunities to engage productively with uncertainty and develop our confidence to say, wow, I really don't know what to do next, but I can take action. I can try things. And so this is something when I was working as director of Innovation House at the University of Connecticut, I had students that selected to live in Innovation House. Innovation House is a dormitory above a classroom, above a huge makerspace, and there's other kind of houses that are thematic. So these are students, undergraduate students from all majors who kind of self-nominated to engage in innovative work. And so part of the curriculum I've developed, which I call a legacy challenge, asks students to identify a problem that matters to them and maybe nobody else recognizes as a problem, and then work to address that problem to make a lasting and positive contribution in the learning and lives of others. And when I present students who self-selected into Innovation House with this thing like, here's a chance for you to identify a challenge or problem and do it. Let's kind of generate some possibilities here. And they were very resistant. They would say things like, well, what kinds of problems should we address? And I said, this is a chance for you to address those, right? And what I came quickly to my awareness in my graduate student team is many of these students never in their lives had been asked to solve a problem, identify, let alone solve a problem of their own. They've been solving problems that have already been solved and have been other people's problems that have been self-selected for them. So they had no experience or confidence in doing that. So what I would argue is this kind of work with actionable uncertainty has to start very young. So this is, Torrance talked about this. Guildford talked about this, right? These are experiences that we can design to kind of build young people's stamina, and even, even if we didn't have that in all of our life, all of our stamina with uncertainty, the willingness to kind of sit with it and see it as a possibility for creativity and for actually making the world a better place. So there are kind of two arms, again, I'll just kind of reiterate, of actionable uncertainty. And the first is kind of encountered. So I just want to spend just a moment kind of exploring that a bit more. So the interesting thing is, no matter how well we plan something, and I kind of alluded to this, there's always a gap between the planned and the lived. And there's this beautiful idea by Ted Aoki, who is a curriculum theorist, who said, when the lesson as planned meets the lesson as lived, there's always going to be this rupture. There's always going to be this opening where we could have never planned this to happen. This child says something that is completely unexpected. What do we do with that? And so, I've written the book, Killing Ideas Softly. One of our moves oftentimes as educators or parents or coaches or whatever is to, softly dismiss those ideas. Say, well, that's an interesting idea, but we need to get back on track here, rather than just take the moment and explore it. So this encountered uncertainty is this kind of in-between space, this liminal space we find ourselves in when the expected meets the unexpected. And we experience this throughout life, especially when we're trying to plan or design an experience for young people or for ourselves, if we take a vacation or whatever. I mean, think about your plans that maybe you had for the summer. Our plans as we now live them in this kind of current moment are very different than we could have ever anticipated. But what could we do with that? How do we kind of explore that? Can we see that as a new opportunity for creative and innovative work? And then on the other side, which I find very interesting, especially for folks that are interested in designing learning experiences and creative learning experiences, is what I call induced uncertainty. So this is purposefully designing experiences with and encounters with uncertainty. So uncertainty by design. And it's this blend, depending on the learning experience, where we still have predetermined elements. So I sometimes call this structured uncertainty as well, where we still provide supports, guidelines, criteria, but we open up the opportunities for students to kind of identify their own problems or their own ways of solving them. So these are the to be determined elements. So when we're designing with uncertainty, what we're trying to do is figure out like, what are the kind of little minimal wireframe structure that we could put around this so people don't feel overwhelmed, and how can we let them know how they can get help when they need it, but still bake into that process by design to be determined elements that are to be determined by the learners, right? And that way, that's genuine uncertainty, because we don't know how the child or the student or the colleague or whomever we're working with, the client, is going to resolve that uncertainty, but we provide the supports to help them do that and the connection. So these are designing experiences that blend predetermined elements with to be determined elements. And so I've been working on a variety of ways of doing this and looking at how to kind of examine this empirically. And one of the ways I talk about this is in the prototypical learning in tasks, whether that's designed for an organization or business or higher education or K-12 schools, is everything's predetermined. So again, the problem's predetermined, the process predetermined, the criteria predetermined, and the product's predetermined. And so when we try to assess those, whether students are successful, it's really, and this is kind of the formula for being good at school, is Did you do what was expected and how it was expected? And that's really the kind of prototypical assessment question. Did students match the expectations in the way we expected? But when we're talking about creativity, it's a little bit different. So I wrote this piece, and I'm an advisor for the Lego Foundation, and they just came out with an assessment issue that talks about like, how do we kind of approach creativity assessment in the classroom? And this is where I talk about, we can kind of take small steps, so you could take this kind of over-planned learning experience, and I describe it as this phenomena of lesson unplanning. And maybe we remove a predetermined problem, or we say, here's a predetermined problem, and here's a way of solving it. Now come up with your own way of solving it using this predetermined process. So again, this is nothing new for creativity researchers, right? These are just like unstructuring little elements, ultimately moving us to panel E, which is really setting up a situation where young people or learners have multiple opportunities to identify their own problems to solve, their own ways of solving them, and their own ways of demonstrating that solution, while we still help design the criteria and supports so that they're not overwhelmed. And this kind of brings us back to Guildford. In a key piece for me that really resonated in Guildford's speech is he makes this assertion to say that a creative act is an instance of learning, which I think is a beautiful line. And actually later on in like 1967, Guildford also wrote that creativity and learning are essentially the same phenomenon, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And we've done some empirical work looking at this, but also I've been building theoretical work that can be tested on this concept of what I call creative learning. And what Guildford was talking about is, we really cannot have a comprehensive theory of learning unless it takes into account both insight and knowledge development and creativity and creative activity, right? So creativity is core to learning and human development. And so what I've tried to do is, take Guildford's charge and build out a theory of creative learning, which again, we've been kind of testing, and I've written a lot about this kind of theoretical model, and I built it in a way so it is empirically testable, so it can be studied, but it can also be used in action research for practitioners. And it has these elements, and I won't go into it, that's a whole different talk, but essentially what it is presenting the learner with a learning stimulus. This has to be a new possibility. If the learner already knows it, right, then creativity can't happen, but neither can learning. So if a child or a student or an adult or a learner is presented with a learning stimulus where they don't really know what to do with it, but it's not too overwhelming, then what ends up happening is this kind of internal creative combination, right? That they're trying to make sense of it based on their existing understanding and the learning stimulus that they're presented. So this is where the creative combinatorial process occurs within the learner. And then once they are able to make sense of that and develop a new understanding, they can share it out and have that tested out. So that happens at the individual level, the interpsychological sphere. But the beauty of creative work and creative learning is by virtue of sharing out an idea in their own way, a way that they've made sense of it, it can actually benefit the learning of teachers and other students. And I talk about many examples of this in my work, but it can even go beyond that and have an impact in the social, historical, and cultural context. So by kind of thinking and planning, not only how can we design experiences that help young people learn, but also honor and give voice to their creative understandings, their unique ways of learning, and allowing them to have voice to not only deepen their own personal learning, but also to benefit the learning of everyone involved in the classroom and beyond the walls of the classroom. So I'm going to stop at that point because I know I covered a lot of ground in a little